He thought my silence was surrender. When my stepfather hit me, the microphone on my work laptop, still active from a late meeting, caught every sickening thud, every hissed threat. He didn't know that the next morning, that very file the waveform would be playing in a boardroom full of executives. By the time he realized his voice was the evidence, the damage was already done. His career, his reputation, all of it was about to be erased by a single audio spike. My name is Clara Monroe. I'm 32 years old, and my world is built on data. From my small, quiet home office in a sleepy Denver suburb, I wrangle vast, chaotic streams of information into clean, predictable patterns. As a senior data analyst for a leading-edge tech firm, I find a serene and profound logic in numbers. They don't lie. They don't get drunk and scream until their faces turn a blotchy, furious red. They are pure, immutable truth. My life, the one I curated for myself within the four walls of my house, was a fortress of order against a world of emotional chaos, a world personified by the man I was forced to call my stepfather. The night it all shattered began like any other quarter-end evening. The house was still, submerged in the kind of deep, late-night silence that lets you hear the hum of the refrigerator from 2 rooms away. I was neck-deep in the final quarterly performance analysis, a sprawling project that involved terabytes of user engagement data. My dual monitors cast a cool blue-white glow across my face, reflecting in my glasses as my fingers flew across the keyboard. SQL queries, data visualizations, predictive models. This was my sanctuary. A late-night Zoom call with the international team had just ended, but I'd left the meeting window open, the cloud recording feature still silently active out of habit. We recorded everything. It was company policy for asynchronous review. The little red dot in the corner of the screen was an innocuous, forgotten star in my digital sky. Then the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the wine glasses in the kitchen cabinet. A tremor went through the floorboards, a seismic warning of an approaching disaster. I knew that sound. It was the sound of Mark coming home after a deal had gone sour, or after a perceived slight at the bar. His rage fueled by bourbon and entitlement. My shoulders tensed instantly, my focus on the intricate lines of code on my screen shattering like glass. I heard his heavy, unsteady footsteps stumbling through the living room, punctuated by a muttered curse as he bumped into the edge of the coffee table. The sanctuary had been breached. My office door, which had no lock, was thrown open. He filled the doorway, a large, looming silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. The sour stench of whiskey preceded him, a foul miasma that polluted the clean air of my workspace. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot and narrowed to slits. He was looking for a target, an outlet for the poison churning inside him, and he had found me. "Still tapping away," he slurred, his voice a low growl. "Always hiding behind that damn screen. You think you're better than everyone, don't you, with your fancy job and your big words?" I didn't answer. I had learned long ago that any response denial, agreement, silence was a spark on a short fuse. My strategy was to become small, invisible, to weather the storm until it passed. I kept my eyes fixed on my monitor, my hands frozen over the keyboard. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm that defied all the logic and order I cherished. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he roared, taking a staggering step into the room. His shadow fell over me, eclipsing the light from my screens. I slowly turned my head, my expression carefully neutral. "Mark, I have to finish this report. It's due in the morning." My calmness seemed to enrage him further. It was a language he couldn't comprehend. He saw control, not fear, and he couldn't stand it. He lunged forward, his heavy hand slamming down on my desk, inches from my laptop. The monitors wobbled. A stack of papers slid to the floor. "This is what matters." "Huh? This little machine," he spat, his eyes wild. He made a grab for the external hard drive, the one containing not just my quarterly report, but years of my professional life. Instinct took over. I wasn't protecting myself. I was protecting my work, my independence, the one part of my life he hadn't managed to taint. I covered the hard drive with both hands, curling my body over it. "Don't," I said, my voice low and tight. "Please, Mark, not my work." A cruel, knowing sneer twisted his lips. It was the look of a predator that had finally cornered its prey, a look I had seen too many times. He leaned in close, his whiskey-sour breath hot on my cheek. "She won't fight back," he sneered, the words spoken not to me, but to some invisible audience in his own twisted mind. It was a pronouncement, a statement of fact he had proven to himself over and over again. Then his open hand struck the side of my head. The force of the blow was a white-hot explosion of pain and light. My glasses flew off my face, and my head snapped back, hitting the wall behind my chair with a dull, sickening thud. The room tilted violently, the cool blue light of my monitors blurring into streaks. A high-pitched ringing screamed in my ears. Through the dizzying fog of pain, my gaze fell on the second monitor. On it, the open Zoom window showed the audio input. A waveform, a visual representation of the sound in the room, was spiking violently. The ambient, gentle hum of the house had been a near flat line. Mark's shout had been a series of sharp hills. But the sound of the slap, the impact of my head against the drywall that was a single, monstrous, jagged peak that shot to the very top of the graph, a bright red line of pure, unadulterated violence. He hit me again, a backhand across my face that sent me sprawling from my chair. I landed hard on the floor, the rough carpet scraping against my cheek. A warm, metallic taste filled my mouth. I could feel something wet and sticky trickling down from my temple, matting in my hair. Every instinct screamed at me to curl into a ball, to disappear, but my eyes remained locked on that screen. I watched, mesmerized, as the waveform danced in a frenzy of chaotic peaks and valleys, a perfect, horrifying transcript of what was happening. His grunts, my choked gasps, the sound of my desk chair skittering across the floor, it was all there, translated into the cold, hard language of data. I didn't try to get up. I didn't scream. I just lay there, on the floor of my sanctuary, watching the digital echo of my own assault. My mind, the analytical engine that I had honed for years, detached from the pain. It saw a data stream. It saw an event. It saw a recording. He stood over me for a moment, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. His rage seemed to have subsided, replaced by a sullen, contemptuous satisfaction. He looked down at me, a crumpled form on the floor, and saw what he expected to see: a victim, the quiet, dutiful stepdaughter who never made a fuss, who absorbed his cruelty and never spoke a word of it to anyone. He believed I was weak, that my silence was surrender. He kicked disdainfully at the leg of my desk, then turned and lumbered out of the room, leaving me in the humming silence, the reek of his whiskey hanging in the air like a ghost. For a long minute, I didn't move. The ringing in my ears slowly faded, replaced by the thudding of my own heart. The sticky warmth on my forehead was blood. The pain was a living thing, a fire spreading through my skull. But underneath it, something else was happening. Something was shifting inside me. A tectonic plate of endurance and suppression that had been under pressure for 15 years had just cracked wide open. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. It was a quiet, definitive snap. The part of me that made excuses, that hoped he would change, that endured for the sake of a fragile peace, died on that carpeted floor. With a slowness that felt ancient, I pushed myself up. My body ached with a deep, resonant pain. I ignored it. I reached for my desk, my hand trembling, and gripped my mouse. My vision was still blurry, but I could see the cursor on the screen. The little red recording light was still on. The waveform had settled back down to a low, quiet line. I moved the cursor over the button that read, "Stop recording." I clicked it. A dialog box appeared, "Save recording to the cloud." My finger hovered over the yes button. This was the moment. He thought I wouldn't fight back. He was right. I wasn't going to fight him. I was going to erase him. Fighting was his language brute force, noise, anger. My language was data. Silent, precise, and permanent. I didn't turn off the machine. I didn't delete the file. I just pressed save. As the file uploaded to a secure company server thousands of miles away, I knew he had walked out of that room believing he had won, believing he had once again asserted his dominance over the quiet girl in the office. He believed I was still his victim, the one who would never, ever fight back. But he was wrong. Something had broken inside me. Yes, but something else had been forged in its place. Something cold and clear and methodical. That waveform, that jagged digital mountain range of his violence, wasn't just a recording, it was a weapon. And it was the beginning of my reply. I woke up not to the gentle prodding of my alarm, but to the dull, insistent throbbing behind my right eye. The world returned to me in pieces. First, the texture of the rough carpet fibers pressed against my cheek. Then, the ache in my ribs, a deep, resonant pain with every shallow breath. Finally, the thin gray light of dawn filtering through the window blinds, slicing the darkness into sterile, unforgiving strips. I had slept on the floor of my office, a soldier fallen at their post. My body felt like a foreign country, one that had been ravaged by a brief, brutal war. My jaw was stiff, my voice a dry, scratchy whisper when I tried to clear my throat. Across the room, my laptop screensaver was gone, the display awake and glowing. It had been my last waking thought, and it was my first conscious one. The machine was still on, a silent accomplice. On the desktop, a single file seemed to pulsate with the room's gray light meeting audio, MP4. The name was so banal, so utterly corporate, a bland label for the ugliest 3 minutes of my life. It blinked, a patient, digital heartbeat waiting for a command. For a moment, the memory of the night before threatened to crash over me, a tidal wave of fear and humiliation. I felt the phantom sting on my cheek, heard the ghost of his sneering voice, but the wave receded as quickly as it came, leaving behind not fear, but a strange and chilling calm. The emotional part of my brain had gone offline. The analyst had taken over. I pushed myself to my feet, each movement a carefully negotiated treaty with my aching muscles. In the adjoining bathroom, I avoided my own eyes, focusing instead on the routine. I turned on the water, splashed my face. The cold was a welcome shock, a grounding sensation. When I finally looked up, the face in the mirror was a grotesque parody of my own. My right cheek was a swollen, mottled landscape of purple and blue. A dark, angry cut, crusted with dried blood, traced a line from my temple into my hairline. My lip was split. This was his signature, the physical data he left behind. I touched the tender skin of my cheek, my fingers tracing the outline of the bruise. There was no surge of self-pity, no tears. I simply saw a data point, an undeniable, physical artifact of the event. As the coffee machine sputtered to life in the kitchen, its screen reflecting a distorted, swollen version of my face, the path forward solidified into something as clear and hard as crystal. I would not fight him with his weapons. I would not scream, or cry, or plead. He was a creature of chaos and brute force. I was a creature of order and logic. I would use my world to dismantle his. I would use data. My company, Veritone Analytics, wasn't just some generic tech firm. We were at the bleeding edge of computational linguistics and audio intelligence. Our clients were law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, and media conglomerates. We built the AI that could isolate a single voice in a stadium crowd, the software that could filter the hiss of a cheap microphone to reveal a whispered conversation, the algorithms that could verify the authenticity of a recording with 99.99% accuracy. We specialized in turning noise into signal. I understood, on a molecular level, the power of a clean audio file. And last night, Mark had handed me the most pristine piece of evidence imaginable. He had recorded his own crime on professional-grade software that time-stamped and encrypted the file the moment it was saved to the cloud. He had no idea what he had done. The thought of a hospital was a fleeting consideration, dismissed almost immediately. A doctor's report, a police interview that would create a narrative I couldn't yet control. It would be my word against his. He was a successful contractor, a charming, manipulative man who knew how to present himself to the world. I was the quiet, reclusive stepdaughter. I knew how that story would be spun. No, I wouldn't report it. I would prove it. I went to my bedroom and chose my armor for the day. Black turtleneck, loose-fitting trousers, and a soft, dark gray beanie pulled low over my forehead to hide the cut. The bruise on my cheek was more difficult. I spent 20 minutes with concealer, building layers not to hide the discoloration completely that was impossible, but to soften its edges, to make it look like a plausible accident, a fall, a bumped door, something mundane. The lie was a necessary piece of the new architecture I was building. The office was an hour's drive away, a journey I made on autopilot. My mind was a whirlwind of structured thought, plotting variables and outcomes. Revenge wasn't a messy, emotional outburst. It was a project. It required a timeline, resource allocation, and a meticulous, step-by-step execution plan. A flowchart began to form in my mind: the file, the company's server, the security protocol, the key stakeholders in IT and HR. Each step was a node in a decision tree, and I was mapping all possible paths to the one inevitable conclusion. When I walked into the office, the familiar hum of the servers and the smell of burnt coffee felt like a homecoming. It was my turf. A few colleagues glanced up. Sarah from marketing, whose desk was near mine, gave me a concerned look. "Whoa, Clara, are you okay? You look exhausted." I manufactured a weary smile. "Hey, Sarah. Yeah, just a late night with the quarterly report. You know how it is." "And the beanie new look," another coworker chimed in. "Just a bad hair day." I lied smoothly. The ease with which the deception came surprised even me. My manager, David, stopped by my desk a little later. He was a good man, sharp and observant. His eyes lingered for a moment too long on the visible part of my bruised cheek. "Monroe, everything all right?" I looked up from my screen, my expression a carefully crafted mask of professionalism. "Everything's great. David, the data set for the Q4 projection is cleaner than I expected. The numbers are solid." I paused, then added, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Data never lies." He nodded, though the concern in his eyes didn't fully dissipate. "Okay, well, let me know if you need anything." He walked away, and I returned to my work, but I wasn't analyzing market trends. I opened a secure connection to our internal server. I found the file, meeting audio, MP4, sitting in my personal cloud directory. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, animal terror that was at odds with the cold precision of my actions. I renamed the file to something innocuous: Q4 Audio Diagnostics Test 7B MP4. I then created a new subfolder deep within the archives of a completed project from 2 years ago. A digital graveyard where no one ever looked. I moved the file there. The company's backup protocol was relentless. Within the hour, that file would be mirrored on servers in Virginia, Oregon, and Dublin. It was now a permanent, indestructible part of the corporate infrastructure. Mark could burn down my house, destroy my laptop, but he could never erase that file. It was safe. The line replayed in my head. A perfect, high-fidelity memory. She won't fight back. It was the thesis of his entire worldview, the core of his power over me. Every time I logged in, every time I ran a query, the words echoed in the silent spaces of my mind. No longer a curse, but a fuel. That evening, when I returned to the hollow silence of the house, I performed the next step. I logged into our home network's router. Mark was technically savvy, but arrogant and lazy with his personal security. His password was, predictably, the name of his favorite sports team, followed by the year they won a championship. I changed the master password to a 64-character string of random alphanumeric symbols that even I wouldn't be able to memorize. Then, I set up a secondary guest network with the old network name and his old password. His phone, his tablet, his smart TV, all of his devices would automatically connect to it, and he would never notice the difference. But this new network was firewalled from my own, and every single data packet that passed through it was now being logged, routed through a monitoring software I'd installed on my personal server. Later, I heard him on the phone in his study, his voice loud and confident, talking to his lawyer about a contract dispute. I sat at my desk, watching the raw data of his voice stream across my monitor. I wasn't just listening, I was capturing it, analyzing the packet headers, timestamping the connection. I was adding to the dataset. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't pack a bag and run. I sat in the quiet of my office, bathed in the blue light of my monitors, and I worked. I was doing what a man like Mark, a man who lived in a world of loud threats and physical intimidation, could never comprehend. I was building a case. I was documenting a crime. I was archiving his oblivion, one silent, meticulously curated kilobyte at a time. The week after the incident was a masterclass in controlled duplicity. On the surface, I was the model employee. I was punctual, efficient, and my contributions in meetings were as insightful as ever. The bruise on my cheek had faded to a sickly yellow-green. Easily disguised with a careful application of makeup, the beanie became a fixture. My new personal brand. I told people I was just cold. No one questioned it. The corporate world is built on a foundation of plausible deniability. People will accept almost any explanation if it means they don't have to get involved. Inside, however, a silent, frantic clock was ticking. My entire being was coiled with a tension so profound it felt like a physical hum beneath my skin. The quarterly performance analysis was due on Friday. It was my magnum opus. A 100-page report filled with dense analytics, predictive modeling, and data visualizations. I spent the week polishing it, ensuring every chart was perfect, every conclusion unassailable. But my real work, the work that consumed every spare brain cycle, happened late at night, long after I'd logged off from the company VPN, using our proprietary audio editing suite. Clarity. I isolated the most potent 60 seconds from the meeting audio at MP4 file. I started the clip just before Mark's slurred speech began, capturing the full sneering venom of his pronouncement, "She won't fight back." I included the sickening, percussive sound of the open-handed slap, my own choked gasp, the dull, hollow thud of my skull hitting the wall, and the 30 seconds of heavy, ragged breathing that followed. Using the software, I scrubbed the ambient noise, enhancing the vocal track and the sounds of the impacts until they were terrifyingly clear. It was a perfect, self-contained narrative of violence. I saved this 1-minute clip as a lossless WAV file. I named it waveform 7B. The name was deliberate, designed to mimic the alphanumeric designation of an automated system test. It sounded like a bug, not a confession. The final step was the most delicate. I couldn't simply attach the audio file to my report. That would be too obvious, too easily traced back to me as a deliberate act. My plan required more finesse. I embedded waveform 7B, not as a file, but as a data object within the source code of an interactive chart in my report. To a casual user, it would be invisible. But to the system's automated integrity scanner, a program designed to find and flag any non-standard data packets within submitted reports, it would appear as a severe data corruption. It was a digital landmine, and I knew exactly whose foot would step on it. Our head of IT security was a man named Arthur Vance. He was a brilliant, relentlessly paranoid man in his late 50s who treated the company's network as his personal fiefdom. Arthur had personally designed the integrity scanner, and his standing rule was that any and all Priority 1 anomalies were to be escalated to him directly. He trusted his system implicitly and his colleagues' technical skills not at all. My carefully corrupted chart was designed to trigger a cascade of errors that would bypass lower-level technicians and land squarely, and exclusively, on Arthur's virtual desk. On Friday at 4:59 p.m., 1 minute before the deadline, I uploaded the report to the central server. The progress bar filled. The upload completed. I clicked Submit. A small, green checkmark appeared on my screen. It was done. The torpedo was in the water. For a full minute, I just sat there, my hands resting on my keyboard, my breathing shallow. Then I packed my bag, wished my colleagues a good weekend, and walked out into the cool evening air, my face an unreadable mask of calm. The following week was the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my job, my outward placidity a stark contrast to the screaming tension within. Every email notification, every Slack message ping, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I feigned interest in project updates and budget meetings, all while running a constant, silent background process in my mind, monitoring, waiting. Mark was sullen and distant at home, a brooding thundercloud of resentment, but he left me alone. He was consumed with his own problems, oblivious to the far greater one I had set in motion. On Thursday afternoon, it finally came. Not an alarm or an emergency summons, but a quiet, unassuming instant message from Arthur Vance. Vance Monroe, I'm looking at your Q4 submission. The analytics are solid, but the system flagged a persistent anomaly in the data stream for Chart 7B. Looks like a corrupted audio packet, possibly a driver conflict during the data render. Have you seen this before? My fingers were ice cold as I typed my reply, carefully measuring each word. Me. That's strange. Arthur, I haven't. It all looked clean on my end. Maybe a new compression artifact from the latest software update I had planted the perfect bait. Hinting at a flaw in a recent system-wide update meant this was no longer about my report. It was about a potential vulnerability in his system. Vance. That's what I'm thinking. The signature is unusual. I'm convening a technical review with the core security team tomorrow at 10 a.m. to isolate it. I'll need you there to walk us through the original dataset. Conference room 3. Me. Of course. See you then. I closed the chat window and took a slow, deliberate breath. The fuse had been lit. The next morning, Conference room 3 felt like an operating theater. It was cold, sterile, and windowless. Around the long table sat the company's best and brightest technical minds, 2 senior network engineers, a data forensics specialist, and Arthur, presiding from the head of the table. I sat near the end, an invited consultant, an expert witness to a crime no one else knew had been committed. Arthur pulled up my report on the main screen, a massive 8K display that dominated the front wall. Okay, people, he began, his tone all business. What we have here is a ghost in the machine, a data packet in Monroe's Q4 analysis that refuses to resolve. He navigated to the chart in question. The system identifies it as an audio file, but it's unreadable by standard players, and it's throwing off the checksum for the entire data block. Forensics couldn't identify the codec. It's a complete black box. For 20 minutes, they debated. They threw around jargon, heuristic analysis, codec mismatch, packet fragmentation. I said nothing, only nodding and offering simple, non-committal answers when asked about my process. I was just the data analyst. I provided the numbers. This technical glitch was their problem to solve. Finally, Arthur, growing frustrated, made the move I had anticipated. I'm going to bypass the player and send the raw signal directly to the speakers. I want to hear what this degradation sounds like. It might give us a clue about the nature of the interference. He typed a few commands into his console. A waveform viewer appeared on the screen, showing a flat black line. The room was silent, save for the hum of the overhead projector. Arthur looked at the team. Okay, listen closely. He hit the enter key. The first sound to fill the acoustically perfected room was the sneer. Mark's voice, thick with whiskey and contempt, was rendered with horrifying fidelity by the room's expensive speaker system. She won't fight back. The voice was intimate, conversational, and utterly chilling. The engineers exchanged confused glances. Before anyone could speak, the next sound came a sharp, wet, percussive crack, the sound of a hand hitting flesh. It was so real, so visceral. that one of the engineers physically recoiled in his chair. It was followed instantly by a choked, feminine gasp, my gasp, and then a heavy, sickening thud, the sound of a human head impacting a solid surface. The room fell into a silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against my eardrums. On the large screen, the waveform viewer had charted the event in a brutal, jagged spike of angry red, a visual scream against the flat line of silence. For 30 eternal seconds, the only sound in the room was the harsh, ragged breathing of a man who had just committed an act of violence. Then, silence again. Arthur's hand was frozen on his keyboard. The forensics specialist, a woman named Lena, had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. No one looked at me. They stared at the screen, at the visual representation of the horror they had just heard. The clinical, academic nature of the meeting had been instantly and irrevocably shattered. Finally, one of the younger engineers, his face pale, turned his head slowly towards me. He swallowed hard. "Clara, whose voice is that?" he asked, his own voice barely a whisper. I lifted my gaze from the screen and looked at him. My expression was neutral, my heartbeat a steady, powerful drum in my chest. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me, a sense of immense and terrible power. "Just a data set," I replied, my voice even and clear. In that moment, I knew the file was no longer mine. It had escaped my control. My laptop, my private war. It was now loose inside the machine, a piece of undeniable truth let loose in a system built on procedure and protocol. It had a life of its own now, and its work was just beginning. The silence that followed my words, "just a data set," was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, sucking the air and the color from the room. Arthur Vance, a man who had built a career on understanding complex systems, stared at the jagged red spike on the screen, his face a mask of dawning horror. He wasn't looking at a corrupted file anymore. He was looking at a crime scene. He finally turned his head. His eyes, which had been narrowed with technical frustration, were now wide with human shock. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time that morning, and in my face, he saw the faint, yellowing ghost of a bruise his system had just given a voice to. The connection was made. The circuit was complete. Without another word, he typed a single command into his console. Session terminated. The screen went black. "This meeting is over," he said, his voice a low, gravelly command. "Everyone, back to your desks. You will not speak of this to anyone. You did not see it. You did not hear it. This is now a Level 1 security incident." His words were a firewall thrown up around the moment. But it was too late. The data was already out. I walked back to my desk in a state of hyper-aware calm. The corporate machine, once I had inserted the right catalyst, was now moving with a terrifying and beautiful velocity. My part in the initial reaction was over. Now, I just had to respond to the prompts. Within an hour, the first shockwave hit, a company-wide email from Arthur's department. Subject line: urgent internal security review in progress. The body of the message was terse and ominous. All access to personal cloud storage was temporarily suspended. All external data transfer was being monitored. All employees were instructed to report any anomalous data on their local or networked machines immediately. The company was in lockdown. They thought the breach was internal. They were treating my life as a virus in their system. And they were trying, frantically, to contain it. I watched my colleagues' faces flicker with confusion and anxiety. Whispers spread through the office like a current. "Did you hear? They think someone planted a logic bomb?" I heard it was industrial espionage. They were all searching for a complex, corporate explanation, because the simple, brutal truth was unthinkable. The second wave came 2 hours later. This one from Human Resources. The subject line was softer, but the implications were harder. Mandatory disclosure. External data exposure. The email, written in the careful, sterile language of corporate law, stated that due to a recent security event, All employees were required to formally disclose any instance where company assets, laptops, software, networks had been used in a manner that might have captured or stored sensitive, non-company data of a personal or external nature. A link was provided to a secure, encrypted disclosure form. Failure to comply would be grounds for immediate termination. This was my cue. The system was now formally requesting the very information I needed it to have. I clicked the link. The form was a series of checkboxes and text fields. I navigated it with the precision of a surgeon. Nature of incident, unauthorized capture of audio data, company assets involved, company-issued laptop, licensed Zoom conferencing software, location of incident employee home office, date and time of incident. I entered the exact date and time, pulled from the file's metadata. Then came the final, open-ended field brief description of the incident and any external parties involved. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Incident originated from a home device during a period of remote work. The recording captures a physical assault. The audio file contains the voice of an external party, Mark Monroe, a contractor for this company, engaging in an act of domestic violence against myself. Clara Monroe, the employee filing this report. I read the paragraph twice. It was cold, factual, and irrefutable. It linked the personal to the professional. It linked him directly to the company. I clicked Submit. An automated response appeared in my inbox 30 seconds later. Your disclosure has been received. You will be contacted by a representative from HR and legal within 2 hours. Please remain at your desk. While I waited, I executed the next step of my plan. I left the office on my lunch break. I drove not to a cafe, but to the downtown Denver police precinct. I walked in, took a number, and waited. When I was finally called, I sat down with a weary-looking officer and filed a formal police report. I didn't cry. I didn't embellish. I stated the facts of the assault, provided Mark's name and address, and told the officer I had a time-stamped, encrypted audio recording of the event, a recording that had already been reviewed by my company's security team. I also provided them with the photos I had taken of my injuries the morning after. The officer's demeanor shifted from bureaucratic indifference to focused attention. He gave me a case number. I now had the official documentation I needed. When I returned to the office, a meeting request was waiting for me. It was with our head of HR, a senior lawyer from our legal counsel, and Arthur Vance. The location was the executive suite, a floor I rarely had reason to visit. The meeting was brief and intense. They didn't ask if it was true. They knew. The raw data of the audio file was proof enough. Their questions were about liability. Was the recording active because of a company directive? Was Mr. Monroe aware he was being recorded? Are there any other copies of this file? I answered truthfully. The recording was active by default per company policy for my team's meetings. Mark was not aware, but the assault took place in my designated, company-approved workspace while company software was in operation. And yes, there were other copies. The file was now archived on multiple, secure corporate servers. I then calmly slid the police report, with its official case number, across the polished table. I have also formally reported the crime, I said. The lawyer picked up the report. His eyes scanned it. This was the final piece of the puzzle. It was no longer a messy personal problem. It was now an official criminal investigation involving a key contractor, with the company's own technology as the primary evidence. Their liability was astronomical. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The meeting ended. I was sent home, placed on paid administrative leave, for my own well-being, but I knew it was to get me out of the office while they cauterized the wound. Before I had even reached my car in the parking garage, the company's security protocol had gone into scorched earth mode. Within 24 hours of that technical review meeting, Mark Monroe's contractor status was suspended. His access to all Veritone analytics systems, from building keycards to email accounts to network credentials, was revoked. As our primary consultant on a new suite of voice recognition security software, his digital existence within our company was simply deleted. He must have discovered it when he tried to log in that evening. My phone rang just after 8 p.m. It was him. I let it ring 4 times, then answered and put it on speaker. My own recording app already running. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice a distorted howl of fury. There was no preamble, no greeting, just pure, undiluted rage. "I don't know what you're talking about. Mark," my voice was a flatline. "My contracts, my access. It's all gone. They said my credentials have been revoked, pending a security investigation. This is your fault. You ruined me." I listened to his tirade, his threats, his accusations. It was all just more noise, more data. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "No, Mark," I said. "You didn't get fired because of me. You got fired because of you. You recorded yourself." I hung up before he could respond. News in a corporation travels faster than light. Despite Arthur's gag order, the story leaked, mutating as it spread. By the next morning, the whispers were everywhere. It wasn't about a system bug anymore. The narrative had found its villain. The internal message boards buzzed with a carefully worded, anonymous summary. "Security contractor under investigation for domestic violence and breach of client privacy. Incident captured on company software." The story was perfect. It had sex, violence, and a high-tech, ironic twist. Mark's small but successful security consulting firm was publicly traded on a smaller index. His reputation was his brand, and that brand was now irrevocably tied to violence and hypocrisy. The market is a ruthless beast. It hates scandal and uncertainty. By the end of the day, his company's stock had plummeted 12%. By the end of the next day, after a tech blog got wind of the internal rumors and published a speculative piece, it was down 17%. I spent those 2 days at home, on leave, but I drove past the office. I sat in a coffee shop across the street, logged into the guest Wi-Fi, and did my job. I submitted my work via email as if nothing had happened. I was an island of perfect calm in the hurricane I had unleashed. In the coffee shop, I saw my coworkers coming and going. I overheard snippets of their conversations. "Can you believe it? The guy who designed our audio security protocols? They say she never even raised her voice, just sent in a report." Then I heard the phrase that made me smile into my cup of latte. It was Sarah from marketing, speaking to an engineer from the networking team. "It's insane," she was saying, her voice a hushed, awestruck whisper. "Someone just detonated a bomb with data." And I took another sip of my coffee, the warmth spreading through me, calm and victorious. The bomb had gone off, and I was safely outside the blast radius. The corporate panic was a contained explosion, its shockwaves reverberating through boardrooms and legal departments. But I knew that for my revenge to be complete, it couldn't stay contained. Mark's world was larger than just one company, and I intended to burn all of it to the ground. The next phase of my plan would take the weapon out of the sterile environment of the corporation and release it into the wild, chaotic ecosystem of the internet. The machine had done its work. Now, it was time for the mob. My administrative leave gave me the one resource I had been lacking: time. In the quiet of my home office, now a command center, I began the meticulous process of planting the seed. First, I used a Tor browser and a series of VPNs, routing my connection through servers in Estonia, Brazil, and Japan, to create a completely anonymous, untraceable email address. With that, I created a new Reddit account. The username was intentionally bland, data neutral. It suggested objectivity, not a personal vendetta. From the 1-minute audio clip, I extracted an even more potent, more viral ready sample. It was exactly 5 seconds long. It contained only 2 sounds: Mark's voice, dripping with arrogant contempt, saying, "She won't fight back," followed immediately by the sharp, sickening crack of the slap. It was short enough to be listened to on a loop, brutal enough to be unforgettable. I ran the file through a metadata scrubber 3 times, stripping every last byte of information that could identify its source, its creator, or the software used to edit it. To any digital forensics expert, the file would appear to have been born out of the ether, I chose my target subreddit with care, not a forum for victims or a true crime community, but our audiophile, a place populated by obsessive audio engineers, sound designers, and hobbyists who would dissect the clip on a technical level before they reacted on an emotional one. I uploaded the 5-second WAV file. The title of my post was a simple, provocative question, designed to bypass skepticism and invite engagement. It read, "What does 'she won't fight back' sound like to you?" I hit post. Then I closed my laptop and went to make a cup of tea. I didn't check it for 3 hours. When I returned, the fuse I had lit was already sputtering. The post had 200 comments and was climbing the subreddit's front page. As I had predicted, the initial responses were technical. "You sound guy 88. Incredible fidelity on this. Whatever mic was used, it's pro-grade. You can hear the moisture in his mouth before he speaks. The percussive at 1.8s has a brutal transient. Sounds like an open palm strike, maybe connecting with a cheekbone. You studio rat. This is chilling. The room has almost no reverb, suggesting a small, carpeted space, an office. Maybe the vocal is so clear. It's not a performance. This feels real." But threaded between the technical analysis, the human reaction was beginning to build. Just a reader. It sounds like every argument my parents ever had before my dad left. Heel Blue Sky 9. It sounds like the reason my sister wears long sleeves in the summer. And then, the one-word answers began to flood in. A tidal wave of gut-level interpretation, abuse, control, power, cowardice, rage. The post broke containment, cross-posted to other, larger communities. By the end of the day, it was on the front page of Reddit. It had thousands of comments and tens of thousands of upvotes. My anonymous question had become a global Rorschach test for violence. The internet, once activated, is a relentless investigative engine. By day 2, the story had a new player, a sharp, young tech journalist named Katya Sharma, who wrote for a popular online publication. She saw what the amateur sleuths were missing. She wasn't focused on the content, but the container. In her article, published late that night, she wrote, "While the audio itself is horrifying, the real story may be in its digital DNA." Analysis of the file's compression artifacts, though heavily scrubbed, reveals trace similarities to a proprietary audio codec, Clarity 7, developed by Denver-based Veritone Analytics. She had found the loose thread, and she pulled. Her article continued, connecting the dots with ruthless efficiency. Veritone Analytics had, just days earlier, suspended its primary audio security contractor, Mark Monroe, Monroe's own company. Monroe Secure Audio had seen its stock price mysteriously collapse. Sharma had found the internal corporate rumors of an investigation, of a leaked audio file. She put it all together in a single, explosive paragraph. The resulting headline was a masterstroke of digital journalism, engineered for maximum impact audio tech CEO, exposed by own company's AI dataset in chilling viral clip. The story went supernova. It was no longer a Reddit post. It was a national news story. The hashtag #SheWantFightBack began to trend on Twitter. Cable news networks picked it up, displaying the red and black waveform on screen as pundits debated its implications. Mark's photo, a smirking, confident corporate headshot, was suddenly everywhere, juxtaposed with the brutal sound of his violence. His name was now inextricably linked to the phrase he had uttered in the dark. He had become a meme, a monster, a symbol. The intense media scrutiny fell like a hammer on the Denver Police Department. Their quiet domestic violence case was now a matter of intense public interest. The department, facing a PR nightmare, held a press conference. They announced that in light of newly surfaced digital evidence, they were escalating the investigation into Mark Monroe. The case was being reopened, not as a simple assault, but as a felony aggravated assault. The system was now moving not at its own pace, but at the speed of the internet. I watched all of this unfold from the quiet of my home. My phone was off. My social media had been deactivated months ago. I was a ghost, observing the destruction from a safe distance. The public narrative had taken over, and it was far more powerful than I could have ever been on my own. I had supplied the data. The world was providing the outrage. One evening, I logged into the anonymous email account I had created. There was only one new message. The sender was a national nonprofit organization that advocated for victims of domestic abuse. The subject line was simple: "Thank you." The email read, "We don't know who you are, and we don't need to, but if you are the woman in that audio, or if you are the person who brought it to light, thank you. You have given a voice to countless people who are forced to suffer in silence. You have shown that there is power in a single voice. We hope you are safe." Tears welled in my eyes, the first I had shed since that night. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound, aching catharsis. A sense of connection to a world I had felt so utterly disconnected from. I read the email 3 times. I did not reply. Instead, I opened the original 1-minute audio file on my laptop. I didn't play it. I just looked at the waveform, the visual representation of that night, the low hum of the room, the sharp rise of his voice, the violent, jagged peak of the assault, and the ragged, uneven line of his breathing afterward. I zoomed in on the spike, the single, vertical line that had changed everything. It no longer looked like a record of my pain. It looked like a heartbeat, a single, powerful, defiant beat that had sent a signal out into the world, strong, steady, and alive. That same day, Mark's digital presence was erased. His LinkedIn profile vanished. His Twitter account, once full of smug pronouncements about tech and security, was deleted. His company's website was replaced with a single page, undergoing maintenance. He had been a man who craved attention, who built his identity on a foundation of professional prestige and social media validation, and now he was gone. He had become a ghost in the machine he once sought to master. I finally understood. My revenge was never going to be a loud, satisfying confrontation. A single moment of victory, that was his way. Mine was quieter. It was a sound wave, propagating outwards in ever-widening circles, silent and invisible but powerful enough to tear a man's world apart. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a shout. It was a signal, spreading far, traveling beyond its source, and it would never, ever stop. For 3 days, the house was a vacuum. After the viral explosion, Mark had simply vanished. His car was gone. His side of the bed remained untouched. The silence he left behind was different from the quiet I was used to. It was a tactical silence, the heavy, ringing stillness before a lightning strike. I knew he wouldn't stay away. Men like Mark don't disappear. They fester. They marinate in their own perceived victimhood until they are drunk on rage and self-pity, and then they return to the source of their problems, seeking a final destructive confrontation. I was not afraid. I was prepared. My administrative leave had become a period of intense preparation. I spent those 3 days fortifying my sanctuary, not with locks and alarms, but with technology. I set up 3 separate, high-fidelity audio recorders in the living room, hidden on bookshelves and behind picture frames. I reactivated the motion-detecting security camera on my front porch and linked it to my phone. I placed a copy of my police report and a freshly granted temporary restraining order in a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter. I was not waiting to be a victim again. I was an analyst preparing for a final predictable data spike. I was waiting for him to come home and perform the last act of his own self-destruction. On the 3rd night, he came. I heard the car first, its engine revving too high before cutting out abruptly. It wasn't parked in the driveway but skewed halfway onto the lawn, its headlights cutting a desperate, crooked path across the front of the house. The car door slammed with the familiar, angry punctuation. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. The porch camera was recording. I tapped the screen and watched a grainy black and white image of him stumbling up the walkway. He was a wreck, his clothes disheveled, his movements unsteady. He was drunk, of course. His key scraped uselessly against the new lock I'd had installed. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by a surge of pure, animal rage. He began to pound on the door, his heavy fists thudding against the solid wood. The whole house seemed to shake with each impact. "Clara, open this damn door. I know you're in there." His voice was a hoarse, shredded version of what it once was, ravaged by alcohol and fury. "You think you can just lock me out of my own house?" "After what you did," I stood in the shadows of the living room, perfectly still, my hand resting on my phone. The hidden microphones were live, their tiny LEDs glowing like patient red eyes in the darkness. Every shouted word, every drunken slur, every percussive blow against the door was being captured, converted into clean, damning data. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he roared, his voice cracking. "Sitting in there behind your screens, pushing your little buttons, you destroyed everything, my company, my reputation, everything I built. You destroyed my life." The self-pity was so profound, so absolute. It would have been pathetic if it weren't so dangerous. He saw none of his own actions, only my reaction. In his mind, the waveform wasn't a recording of his violence. It was the weapon I had used to attack him. I waited until his pounding subsided, replaced by heavy, ragged breathing against the other side of the door. The moment was right. I had enough. I walked to the door, my footsteps silent on the rug. I took a steadying breath, pressed dial on my phone for the police dispatch, a call I had been ready to make for 72 hours, and whispered my address and the code for a restraining order violation in progress. Then, I turned the deadbolt and opened the door. Just a few inches. He was worse up close. His face was blotchy and swollen, his eyes bloodshot and lost in a fog of booze and hatred. The stench of stale whiskey washed over me, a nauseating ghost of the last time I had seen him. "There you are," he spat, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting his lips. He pushed against the door, but I held it firm. "You're not welcome here." "Mark," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "Not welcome." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I paid for this house. I paid for everything you have. You have nothing without me." He slammed his shoulder into the door, trying to force his way in. The wood groaned. "You did this. You ruined me." This was it, the final confrontation, the last scene. I looked him directly in his bloodshot eyes, the shadows of the living room hiding my face, my voice emerging from the darkness. "No," I said, the word precise and cold. "I didn't ruin you. You did. When you hit record." For a second, the statement seemed to short-circuit his drunken brain. He stared at me, his mouth agape, and then the rage returned, hotter than before, because he knew it was the truth. He let out an incoherent roar and lunged, not for the door, but for me. His hand shot through the opening, his fingers clamping down on my arm like a vice. The pain was a familiar, ugly shock, but this time, it was different. This time, it was a trigger. As his fingers dug into my flesh, the night exploded in flashing red and blue lights. 2 police cruisers, which had been waiting silently at the end of the street, screeched to a halt at the curb. Doors flew open. 2 uniformed officers were on the porch in seconds, their movements swift and certain. "Police, let her go." Now one of them shouted, his hand on his holstered weapon. Mark froze, his head snapping towards the lights, his face a mask of utter disbelief. His grip on my arm slackened. He was a trapped animal, blinded by the sudden, inescapable reality of his situation. They pulled him off the porch, his drunken protests and slurred threats filling the quiet suburban night. He struggled as they forced his hands behind his back, the metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the sudden silence. He was still shouting as they led him towards the cruiser, a pathetic, broken mantra of his own delusion. His head was twisted around, his eyes desperately searching for me as I stood in the doorway. "She won't fight back." He screamed, his voice raw with desperation. The words aimed at the officers, at the neighbors peering from behind their curtains, at the universe that had so profoundly betrayed him. "She never fights back." I stepped out from the shadows of the doorway, into the pulsing blue and red light. One of the officers had his body camera pointed in my direction, its small green light indicating it was recording. I looked past Mark, directly into the lens. This was my final entry into the record. I spoke quietly, my voice barely a whisper, but clear and resonant in the cold night air. I already did. The officer placed Mark in the back of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, cutting off his final desperate shout. The cars pulled away, their sirens silent, their flashing lights sweeping across the houses before disappearing down the street. I stood there for a long moment, the sudden silence of the night rushing in to fill the void. A neighbor's door quietly clicked shut. The show was over. It took less than an hour for the picture to hit the internet. A local news photographer, monitoring the police scanner, had caught the perfect shot. It was Mark, his face contorted in a mask of pure, impotent rage, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving flash of the camera as an officer guided him into the squad car. It was the face of a man whose power had been utterly and completely stripped away. Within minutes, the image was everywhere. The final, brutal punctuation mark on the story of his downfall. He fought the law, waveform justice. I finally went back inside and closed the door, engaging the new deadbolt. The click was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I looked around the silent, empty house. It was just a space, just rooms and furniture, but for the first time in 15 years, it was mine. I walked into my office and sat down at my desk. I navigated to the folder where I had saved the original audio file meeting audio, MP4. I looked at its name, at the date and time it was created. It felt like a relic from another lifetime, an artifact from a war that was finally over. I no longer needed it. The company had its copy. The police had theirs. Its purpose as a weapon was served. Its purpose as a memory was a burden I no longer needed to carry. My hand was perfectly steady as I right-clicked on the file. I moved the cursor down the menu until it hovered over the word delete. I didn't hesitate. I clicked. A small dialog box appeared. Are you sure you want to permanently delete this file? I pressed enter. The file vanished. The waveform was gone, and in its place, for the first time, there was only silence. A clean, peaceful, and absolute silence. The arrest was a catalyst, accelerating the chemical reaction I had started. Mark's personal downfall was now a matter of public record, but the corporate fallout, I soon discovered, was a far more elegant and devastating spectacle. It was cleaner, colder, and played out not in the messy chaos of a suburban street, but in the sterile, unforgiving language of press releases and stock market tickers. I watched from the sidelines as the empire he had built on a reputation of security and control collapsed under the weight of a single, 60-second audio file. The week after his arrest, the board of directors of Monroe Secure Audio held an emergency meeting. The result was announced in a terse, late-afternoon press release. Richard Sterling, the CEO Mark had installed to manage the company's day-to-day operations, had resigned, effective immediately, for personal reasons. It was the corporate equivalent of a ritual sacrifice, a desperate attempt to sever the company from its toxic founder. But it was like trying to save a severed limb with a Band-Aid. The brand was Mark Monroe. His name was on the letterhead. The poison had already reached the heart. Major partners began to pull out in a steady, relentless exodus. A major investment bank, for whom Monroe Secure Audio was developing a next-generation voice biometric security system, publicly terminated their multi-million-dollar contract, citing a breach of their partnership's ethics and integrity clause. One by one, his clients abandoned him, each press release another nail in the coffin. They weren't just firing a contractor, they were publicly disavowing a man who had become a symbol of hypocrisy. He sold security but brought violence. He sold trust but harbored deceit. In the world of corporate reputation, there is no greater sin. I tracked the company's stock price on my laptop. The jagged downward trend of the graph, a beautiful, satisfying echo of the waveform that had started it all. The media, in its insatiable need to label and categorize every event, had christened the entire affair the waveform case. It became a trending topic, a cultural touchstone for a week. Pundits on cable news debated its implications with theatrical gravity. Tech journalists wrote long-form articles about the weaponization of personal data. Legal analysts argued over the nuances of privacy law and corporate liability. My trauma had been abstracted, turned into a fascinating case study at the intersection of technology, justice, and gender politics. I felt a strange, detached irony watching them dissect the case. They were analyzing the shrapnel, but they had no concept of the bomb itself, or the quiet, methodical woman who had built it. My anonymity, for the moment, was holding to the world. I was the shadowy figure at the center of the storm, the unidentified Veritone employee. This mystique made me an even more compelling figure. Soon, the requests for interviews began to trickle in. Passed through my company's legal department, I ignored them all, until a request came from a producer for a respected national news program. They offered a completely anonymous interview. My face would be in shadow. My voice electronically altered. I agreed. I had one more message to send, and this was the perfect platform. The television studio was cold and dark, a cavern of cables, cameras, and quiet, focused technicians. I sat across from the interviewer, a woman known for her sharp, incisive questions. A small microphone was clipped to my shirt. I could feel its presence, a tiny technological echo of the laptop microphone that had started it all. The interviewer's questions were predictable. She asked about the company's response, the police investigation, the viral nature of the story. I answered in calm, measured tones, giving away nothing of myself, focusing only on the facts, the data. Then, she leaned forward, her expression shifting from journalistic inquiry to something more personal. "Many people are calling you a hero," she said, her voice soft. "But others say that what you did wasn't justice. It was revenge, a calculated, public destruction of a man's life. Do you think revenge is justified?" The studio was silent. The cameras were focused on my shadowed form. This was the question they had brought me here to answer. They were hoping for a tearful confession, a passionate defense, an emotional soundbite. I gave them none of it. I paused for a beat, letting the question hang in the air. "Revenge is an emotional word," I replied, my modulated voice sounding robotic and calm. "I'm a data analyst. I prefer to be more precise. What I pursued was accountability. Revenge is just accountability with better sound quality." A few of the technicians behind the cameras let out an involuntary laugh. The interviewer herself broke into a surprised, wide smile. They saw it as a clever, witty line, a perfect, quotable moment for the evening news. They were all smiling, but I wasn't. I was deadly serious. My goal had never been the messy, emotional satisfaction of revenge. It was the cold, mathematical certainty of accountability. I wanted to balance the equation. The truth was, I never wanted to destroy Mark. I just wanted him to hear himself, to truly, for the first time in his life, hear the ugliness in his own voice, the sneering contempt, the ragged, hateful breathing. A man like him exists in a soundproof room of his own ego. My goal was simply to pipe the sound of his own soul back into that room, amplified through the speakers of several million television sets. That, to me, was justice. When my administrative leave ended, I returned to an office that was profoundly different. The whispers that had once followed me had been replaced by a wide, awkward berth of silence. My colleagues looked at me with a new, unsettling mixture of fear, respect, and morbid curiosity. I was no longer just Clara Monroe, the quiet data analyst. I was the woman at the center of the waveform case. I was the one who had detonated a bomb with data. A week after my return, a company-wide email announced the Employee of the Quarter awards. My name was at the top of the list. The accompanying paragraph was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, praising my unwavering commitment to procedural integrity and the safeguarding of company assets under uniquely challenging circumstances. They had taken the ugliest moment of my life and turned it into a glowing performance review. The award came with a bonus and a small, engraved plaque. The next day, my manager, David, approached my desk, the plaque in his hands. "The whole executive team is incredibly impressed. Clara," he said, his voice hushed. "This is from all of them." I looked at the cheap, gold-colored plate, my name engraved beneath the company logo. They wanted to hang my victory on their wall, to absorb my story into their corporate narrative of excellence. They wanted to make it about them. I pushed the plaque gently back across the desk towards him. "Thank you, David, but I can't accept it," I said quietly. "I didn't do it for the company." He looked confused. "But your report on the data anomaly—" I just pressed save. I interrupted, my voice soft but firm. It was the simplest, most honest explanation. It was a binary choice. It had nothing to do with key performance indicators or procedural integrity. I was refusing to let them own it. I expected a reprimand, a call from HR. Instead, later that afternoon, I received a direct email from our CEO, a man I had never met and had only seen in company-wide video addresses. The subject line was simply, "Your work." The body of the email was just 2 short lines. It was not a formal commendation. It was not a lecture about accepting corporate awards. It was something else entirely. "Clara, I understand your position. We heard you. Sincerely, Robert Harrison, CEO." I stared at that last line for a long time. "We heard you," not "we believe you," which would have implied a need for faith, not "we support you," which would have been a hollow HR platitude. We heard you. It was a technical acknowledgement, an admission from the highest level of a company built on audio intelligence that my signal, my single, desperate data point, had successfully been received and understood. They had heard the waveform, and in that moment, in the quiet of the office, surrounded by the silent awe of my colleagues, that was the only award I ever needed. Mark's final move was not one of violence, but of a desperate, twisted legalism. It was the last resort of a man who, having lost the battle for public opinion and corporate power, sought refuge in the arcane complexities of the law. 2 months after his arrest, a courier delivered a thick, formal envelope to my door. Inside was a civil lawsuit. Mark was suing me for invasion of privacy and illegal wiretapping, seeking millions in damages for the irreparable harm I had inflicted upon his personal and professional life. I read the document in the quiet of my kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. The language was a labyrinth of legalese, but the narrative was simple. It painted me as a vengeful spy, a vindictive technophile who had illegally recorded a private, domestic moment and maliciously distributed it to destroy him. It was a masterpiece of projection, a story in which the perpetrator had successfully cast himself as the victim. I felt no fear, no anger. I simply felt a profound sense of weariness. It was the last, predictable twitch of a dying beast. This was not a fight. It was a cleanup operation. My company, Veritone, had a vested interest in the outcome. The lawsuit was not just against me, but implicitly against their software and their corporate policies. They provided me with their best legal counsel. My lawyer was a woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to Arthur, a sharp, impeccably dressed partner at a top Denver law firm who specialized in intellectual property and digital privacy. Our first meeting took place in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city. Eleanor had the entire case file spread out before her, the audio file, the metadata analysis, my employment contract, and Mark's now terminated contractor agreement. She listened to my account without interruption, her expression unreadable. His entire case rests on the reasonable expectation of privacy, she explained when I had finished, her voice crisp and devoid of sentiment. He will argue that a private conversation in his own home is protected. Our job is to prove that this was not the case. Our response was not an emotional appeal. It was a cold, methodical dismantling of his claim. We filed a motion to dismiss, a legal document that was less a defense and more a technical treatise. Our argument was threefold. First, the recording was made in my designated home office, a space contractually recognized by Veritone as a remote extension of their corporate environment. Second, the recording was made by company software, governed by a terms of service agreement that all employees and contractors, including Mark, had digitally signed, acknowledging the software's recording capabilities for business purposes, and third, and most crucially, there can be no reasonable expectation of privacy during the commission of a violent criminal act. Appended to our motion was a mountain of digital evidence. We included the server logs showing the exact time the Zoom meeting was initiated and when the cloud recording began. We included the software's source code documentation. We included a sworn affidavit from Arthur Vance, attesting to the file's integrity and the manner in which it was discovered. We were not arguing about a private conversation. We were presenting evidence of an assault captured by a corporate asset during its normal, documented course of operation. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a small, wood-paneled courtroom that felt more like a library than a legal battleground. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and floor polish. I sat beside Eleanor at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle, Mark sat with his lawyer, a florid, overweight man who seemed to sweat confidence. Mark looked diminished. He had lost weight, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. He refused to look at me, keeping his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. The judge was an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of profound impatience. She had clearly read our motion to dismiss and seemed unimpressed by the theatrical arguments of Mark's lawyer, who spoke of the sanctity of the home and the dangers of unchecked surveillance technology. When he had finished, the judge turned her gaze to me. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses for a long, silent moment. "Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice cutting through the stuffy courtroom air. "The evidence you have presented is technically compelling, but one question lingers. The incident occurred on the evening of April 17th. You did not file a police report until April 25th, after the recording had been discovered by your employer. Why did you not report this assault immediately?" It was the question I had been waiting for. It was the human question, the one that the digital evidence could not answer. Mark's lawyer leaned forward, a smug look on his face. He expected a story of fear, of shame, of a woman too intimidated to act. He expected a confession of weakness. I stood up, my hands resting on the table in front of me. I looked directly at the judge, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady. "For 15 years, I lived in a world where my voice had no value. It was just noise. I knew that if I went to the police that night, it would be my word against the word of a successful, charming man. It would be my noise against his signal." I paused, letting the silence settle. "I did not report it immediately because I have learned, through long and painful experience, that a quiet truth is not enough. To be heard, the truth must be amplified. I did not report it immediately because no one listens until the sound hurts." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a profound, ringing quiet that felt more significant than any sound. Mark's lawyer's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed uncertainty. The judge held my gaze, her expression unreadable, but intense. She had heard me. The signal had been received. "I think it's time we heard the evidence," she said finally, her voice low. Eleanor nodded to the clerk. A speaker had been set up on the table before the judge's bench. The clerk clicked a mouse, and the sound filled the courtroom. It was different in here. The sound, which had been so shocking in the corporate boardroom and so viral on the internet, took on a new, horrifying gravity in the solemn, official silence of the court. The sneer, the slap, the thud, each sound echoed off the dark wood and the leather-bound books. A raw, undeniable artifact of brutality. It was an obscene intrusion of violence into a place of order and reason. I did not watch the judge or the lawyers. I watched Mark. As the sound of his own voice filled the room, a profound change came over him. His shoulders, which had been squared in a show of defiance, began to slump. The color drained from his face. He stared down at the polished surface of the defendant's table as if it were a vast, empty abyss. When the sound of his own ragged, post-assault breathing played, He squeezed his eyes shut, and then, slowly, deliberately, as if under an immense and unbearable weight, he bowed his head until his forehead was nearly touching the table. It was not a gesture of respect. It was a gesture of complete and utter surrender. He had finally been forced to listen. When the recording ended, the silence returned. Heavier than before, the judge looked at Mark's bowed head for a moment, then at his lawyer, whose face was pale. "This lawsuit," the judge said, her voice a gavel in itself, "is a flagrant and offensive abuse of the court's time. The motion to dismiss is granted, with prejudice. Mr. Monroe's claims are without merit and, frankly, appalling." She wasn't finished. Furthermore, having been presented with incontrovertible evidence of a violent felony, this court is referring this entire case file, including the audio recording and the testimony given here today, to the district attorney's office with a recommendation that the existing charges against Mr. Monroe be upgraded to reflect the severity of this assault. It was over. His final, desperate attack had not only failed, it had brought down the full weight of the law upon his own head. I walked out of the courthouse alone. The sky was a flat, uniform gray, and a light. Misty rain had begun to fall, the kind that seems to hang in the air rather than descend. It slicked the granite steps and beat on the shoulders of my coat. The air smelled of wet pavement and exhaust fumes. It was a day much like the night it had all begun. I stood on the steps for a moment, tilting my face up into the cool, damp air. I remembered the fear I had felt that night, the way the sound of the rain had seemed to amplify my own terrified heartbeat, trapping me in a world of oppressive, threatening noise. But now, the sound of the drizzle on the pavement was just a sound. It was gentle. It was clean. It was just weather. This time, the rain was not a cage. It was washing the world clean, and it was no longer frightening at all. A year is a measurement of time, a planetary journey. For me, it was a process of reclamation. Mark was a name in a prison ledger. His sentence for felony assault a matter of public record. His company had been dismantled and sold for parts. A corporate carcass picked clean by its competitors. I had moved out of the house, that silent, wounded place, and into a bright, clean apartment downtown with a view of the mountains. I was still at Veritone, promoted to a lead role where I managed my own team. My work a familiar, comforting world of logic and order. The noise of the past had faded, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm of my own making. Then, an email arrived from a producer at a major television network. They were producing a documentary special, an in-depth piece on landmark cases where technology had played a pivotal role in delivering justice. It was to be called Voices That Fought Back. They were covering the waveform case, and they wanted to know if the anonymous woman at its center would be willing to speak. My initial instinct was to refuse. I had my peace, my hard-won anonymity. Why would I risk it? Why would I reopen the door to that dark room? I let the request sit in my inbox for a week. During that time, I saw the story of the waveform referenced online, used as a shorthand for digital justice. I saw women on forums talking about their own waveform moments, the day they saved a threatening email, the day they recorded a harassing phone call. My story was no longer just mine. It had become a symbol, a piece of public property. And if it was going to be told, I realized, I needed to be the one to tell it. Anonymity had been a shield when I was at war, but the war was over. Now, it was starting to feel like a cage. I wrote back to the producer with a single sentence. Yes, I will do it, and I will be doing it as myself. Clara Monroe. The day of the broadcast felt surreal. I sat in a studio, the same one where I had given my anonymous interview a year before, but this time the lights were bright. There were no shadows to hide in. The interviewer, the same woman from before, gave me a small, encouraging smile as the floor manager began the countdown. I thought, for a fleeting moment, of that other countdown. The silent, terrifying seconds before Mark had burst into my office. The memories were still there, but they were no longer landmines. They were ghosts, and I was no longer afraid of them. The special began, weaving together the stories of several people who had used digital evidence to find justice. Then, my segment started. The screen filled with the cool blue and black aesthetic of a data visualization. News clippings and headlines about the waveform case flashed by. Then, the waveform itself appeared. It was not the angry, jagged red spike I remembered from my monitor. The documentary's graphic artists had rendered it as a clean, pulsing line of electric blue. It looked technical, powerful, and controlled. It was no longer a representation of my pain. It was a representation of my power. The interviewer's voiceover narrated the basic facts of the case. Then, the camera was on me. I was not the haggard, bruised woman from a year ago. I was poised, my expression calm, my voice clear. I saw in the monitor a woman I was still getting to know. Someone forged in a fire I had not chosen, but had survived. He said I wouldn't fight back, I said, looking directly into the camera lens, speaking not to the interviewer, but to the millions of people watching, to anyone who had ever been told they were weak, that they were nothing. He was wrong. The interviewer's voice was gentle when she asked the next question. The world saw your victory, Clara. But they didn't see the battle. What did this fight, this victory, cost you? The question was meant to draw tears, to evoke a sense of victimhood that would resonate with the audience. I thought about how to answer it. I could have talked about the years of fear, the sleepless nights, the friendships I'd lost because I couldn't explain the darkness I lived with. I could have talked about the loss of a mother who had chosen her husband over her daughter. It had cost me my youth, my trust, my sense of safety in the world. It had cost me nearly everything, everything. I answered, my voice quiet but firm. It cost me everything I was. But I've learned that there are things that cost more. I paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. Silence costs more. Silence costs your future. It costs your soul. It's a debt that compounds interest every single day you carry it. I was no longer willing to pay it. The interview ended. The documentary cut to a commercial break. But on the internet, the conversation was just beginning. The hashtag the network had created. She fought back, started to move. At first, it was just people reacting to the interview. But then, something organic, something beautiful and unexpected, began to happen. A young woman, a graphic designer from Austin, posted a screenshot of a waveform. It was from an audio file of her resignation call with a verbally abusive boss. Her caption read, "He told me I'd never work in this town again. This is the sound of me proving him wrong." She fought back. A few minutes later, a lawyer from Chicago posted another. It was the sound of her delivering her closing argument in her first major trial. A case everyone told her she would lose. Then another, from a scientist, showing the audio data of a breakthrough she had made after being told her research was a dead end. The hashtag became a river, then a flood. Thousands of women began posting their own waveforms of songs they had written, of business pitches they had nailed, of conversations where they had stood up for themselves or for someone else. They posted the sound of their baby's heartbeats, of their own laughter after escaping a bad relationship. They took my symbol of violence and transformed it into a universal icon of defiance, resilience, and triumph. Each post was a small act of reclamation, a declaration that their voices mattered, that their signals would not be lost in the noise. I sat on the couch in my quiet apartment, the television off, my laptop open on my coffee table. I scrolled through the hashtag for nearly an hour, a silent observer to the movement I had unintentionally started. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of pain or of memory. They were tears of awe, of a profound and overwhelming sense of connection. The signal I had sent out a year ago was no longer just my own. It had been received, amplified, and answered by a chorus of other voices, a symphony of strength. I finally closed the laptop. The blue light from the screen vanished, leaving the room in the soft, warm glow of a single lamp. I leaned my head back and smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. The battle was over. The story was told. The equation was balanced. The revenge was complete. And it had been achieved exactly as I had intended from the very beginning. Not with rage, not with violence, not with blood, but with data. Clean, irrefutable, and absolute. Weeks after the broadcast, the digital roar of "She Fought Back" had softened to a steady, powerful hum. The movement had taken on a life of its own, a self-perpetuating current of shared strength that no longer required my story as its catalyst. My part was done. The world had the narrative it needed. But there was one final piece of data to process, one last entry to make in the log. It wasn't for the world, or for the company, or even for Mark. It was for me. Late one evening, in the quiet of my new apartment, the city lights a glittering, silent galaxy beyond my window, I logged into the Veritone Deep Archive. My new security clearance gave me access to the digital evidence vaults, the most secure corners of the company's servers where files related to legal cases were kept in immutable, time-locked storage. I navigated through layers of encryption, my fingers moving with familiar, quiet confidence, and there it was, the original file. Not the edited clips, not the compressed viral versions, but the raw, unedited source meeting audio, MP4. I downloaded a local copy, the progress bar a slow, deliberate crawl. When it was finished, I opened it not in an audio player, but in the Clarity 7 editing suite. The waveform appeared on my screen, a familiar and now distant landscape, the flat line of quiet, the rising hills of his drunken entry, the sharp, violent mountain of the assault, the chaotic, ragged peaks of his breathing. I looked at it not with trauma, but with the dispassionate eye of an analyst examining a historical record. It was simply an event that had occurred, a data point that had been logged. My eyes drifted to the very end of the file. After the sound of his footsteps faded, after the door to my office closed, there were 3 seconds of near-perfect silence. It was the space between his departure and the moment my trembling hand had found the mouse to click "Stop recording." For a year, I had thought of it as dead air, an empty space, but I was wrong. It wasn't empty. It was the beginning of my reply. It was the sound of a survivor taking her first breath alone in the wreckage, and it deserved to have a signal. I picked up a high-sensitivity microphone, the kind used for capturing subtle environmental audio, and clipped it to the collar of my shirt, directly over my heart. I closed my eyes and breathed, in and out. I was not afraid. I was not angry. I was calm. I was here. I hit record. For 30 seconds, I captured the only sound in the silent room, the soft, steady, rhythmic beat of my own heart. Thump, 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 a signal of life, a waveform of survival. I opened the new recording. The waveform was beautiful in its simplicity, a series of gentle, perfectly spaced, rounded peaks. It was the antithesis of the jagged, violent spike Mark had created. His was a waveform of chaos. This was a waveform of order. With the precision of a surgeon, I selected my heartbeat and inserted it into those final 3 seconds of silence in the original file. I was not erasing what he did. I was appending my own conclusion to his narrative. He had created the spike of violence. I was adding the final, steady pulse of life. It was a definitive statement. The story did not end with his rage. It ended with my heartbeat, continuing on, steady and strong. I saved the newly edited, final version of the file. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I typed the new name, Final Spike, Wave. The final spike wasn't his, it was mine. Then, I uploaded the new file back to the Veritone Deep Archive, placing it beside the original. A text box appeared, prompting for an annotation for the upload. I typed a single sentence, the final analysis of the waveform case. Note silence is data 2. The upload progress bar filled, completed. The screen glowed, its cool, blue-white light illuminating my face. There was no anger there, no hatred, no tears, just a profound and unshakable calm. My work was done. The equation was balanced. My hand moved to the mouse. I clicked save. Then, I moved the cursor to the top right of the window and clicked Exit. The program closed. My desktop appeared for a second, then faded to black. There was no music. There was no final monologue. Just a line of simple, white text that materialized in the center of the silent, black screen. He said I wouldn't fight back. The waveform disagreed. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. And to help this story reach more people, you can give it an extra boost by hitting that hype button. Your support means the world.